welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Welcome, everyone, to a very special episode of the At Peace Parents podcast. I am here with my favorite clinical psychologist, Dr. Klein. He's a family therapist, a couples therapist, and works with families with PDA, children and teens. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that is on all of your minds, I know because I received the emails, which is, what do I do when my co-parent, spouse, partner, or ex-partner is not on board or doesn't believe in the PDA approach or PDA in general? So welcome, Alex. I'm so happy you're here.
Thanks for having me, Casey. I love chatting with you, and thanks for inviting me on again.
Yeah, absolutely. So today I'm super excited to talk to you about this topic because of your expertise and the patterns that you've noticed and the work that you do with families. So I think I'll just kick it off with a bigger picture question, which is, what types of patterns do you see from the clients that you've worked with who have PDA children and teens in terms of what comes up in the marriage, in the relationship, and in the co-parenting space?
Oh, wow. So much there. I'm not even sure where to begin. But a common dynamic I see, I'd say this is at least like 2/3 of the time in a two-parent household where like one parent is way more on board with understanding PDA as a neurotype and parenting through a PDA lens. One parent is way more on board than the other. Sometimes it's like they're close, close, but not quite there. But yeah, that is very, very, very common for people not to quite be on the same page. That's probably the most common thing I see. There's a lot there. I think that one of the things that can happen that I've found interesting, I've sort of been more tuned into lately, is that sometimes when one parent is more like sort of more authoritarian or more on the sort of like high discipline end of the spectrum, and the other parent is way more sort of following the PDA parenting strategies and very collaborative and flexible with their kids and all this stuff, that, that kind of lack of balance, that sometimes the parent who is observing one parent being too harsh, let's say, kind of almost feels like they need to compensate for that by being extra not harsh, and vice versa. Like the parent who sees the other parent, maybe being like super flexible or not, having certain expectations for the kid, feels like they need to really amp up those expectations. And that's something that is interesting. And ideally, of course, we find, some balance there, figure out what the right level of demands for the child is. Typically with a PDA, we're talking about lowering demands and understanding hidden disabilities and what the right level of expectations are. But those are just two initial things that come to mind as like really, really common issues. And I really like to kind of normalize that challenge for parents, because I feel like the sort of difficulty getting on the same page, it really kind of reflects a child with a challenging neurotype that we have not, as a culture, as a society, as clinicians, we've not adequately understood and supported families when there is a PDA neurotype. But that's just some of many, many issues. There's all kinds of issues that can come up, though. Like in the experience of my experience doing couples therapy, there's some issues that come up, like regardless of whether one has kids or not, regardless of whether, there's a PDA, or there certainly can be overlap in the type of issues that people experience, but those are some initial things that come to mind.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about that? So for me, my whole sample is parents of PDA children and teens. And because I'm not a psychologist or a clinician, I don't have any experience working with parents outside of that niche, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I know that you do, where it's like you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have worked with parents of ADHD kids, of non-PDA.
Definitely. Yes, absolutely.
I imagine it's difficult for all families to adjust to a new parenting approach that fits their child's neurotype and going through that acceptance piece. But do you see a difference between that dichotomy between parents of one being on board and one having a harder time as being more pronounced in the PDA realm versus other neurotypes, or not?
Yeah, I definitely think kind of all the things that parents of any child experience like can absolutely be harder when you have PDA neurotype, again because we have the issue of inadequate understanding of the PDA neurotype and maybe inappropriate recommendations from providers. But these things around that parents and that issues that happen in marriage that can happen after having kids in general is like less time with each other, or financial strain associated with this, or one parent feeling like they have to do more of the child rearing and having some potentially some resentment around that. All these things just get really exacerbated in the PDA space for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, that was kind of my intuition. And I certainly would say that, I think a lot of parents who email or comment on social media or who are in our programs feel like there's something wrong with them or their spouse, that they're not on the same page. But like you, Alex, I would say it's more common than not for them to not be on the same page, especially at the beginning. And
Hmm.
I think that part of that is because, a lot of what the main caregiver, or the person who's spending the most time with the kid, who is usually the mom, not always,
Hmm.
is like, even if it doesn't look like they're doing anything, they're constantly scanning for the
Hmm.
environment, and like they're hyper vigilant to like, what do I need
Oh yeah.
to prevent the next huge fight flight episode, or to prevent shutdown, or like this extraordinarily intense nervous system response. But you can't see that from the outside
Right.
looking in, right? So if the partner is working outside the home and then comes home and just sees like mom being, quote, a little overbearing, or like, quote, taking things too seriously or being too flexible, it's like from the outside looking in, you can't actually see the level of hypervigilance and scanning of the other nervous system that the lead parent is doing.
Oh yeah, that mental labor is very hidden and definitely has a cost, right? And especially as you put it, hypervigilance, right? And that's a term we use in the PTSD world, right? It's like if you've experienced these sort of huge meltdowns and like sometimes really violent in some cases and scary, then of course there's going to be some extra hypervigilance. Like how can we make sure that doesn't happen again? I mean, it makes sense, but yeah, there is a lot there for sure.
Yeah. The other pattern, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that I
Hmm.
find there to be a large proportion of parents who one or both are also neurodivergent, right? Whether
Yeah,
autistic,
yeah.
ADHD, and often, the beginning of that journey of that self-awareness is forced upon them potentially by their kids' burnout or
Right, right.
and so there can also, I find, some of the most intense resistance from co-parents has come from an undiagnosed PDA or autistic spouse.
Yeah, totally. That's such an important thing to be thinking about, like sort of, and often undiagnosed, not always, but undiagnosed, or and sometimes
Unaware. Yeah.
unaware of the, unrecognized neurodivergence in one or both members of the family, which is so interesting because on the one hand, it can be like a kind of, let's say the parent and the child share neurodivergent traits, and that can be a real advantage that maybe the parent has sort of a sensitivity to and an understanding of what the kid is going through. And here's something that we look at, when I work with families sometimes around, and especially when both parents aren't on the same page, is like how was your neurodivergence or your, challenges you experienced as a kid? Like, how was that responded to by your parents? Right. And I think sometimes there, I might hear response like, well, not well, and like we might need to explore that a little bit. Right. Sometimes I hear, well, like when I, had trouble doing this, like I just got yelled at and I shaped up, right? So like my
Yeah.
kids should be able to do the same. And the truth is that like maybe your kid has similar traits as you do as the parent for sure, but your kid's also not exactly the same as you. And so so your child's also different than you, and your child might have less ability to quote unquote shape up in the way that you were when you were a child, right? So a lot of these things come into play here.
Yeah, I'm going to play the devil's advocate and voice one of the questions that I've gotten to you,
Sure.
which is
Yeah.
like, well, no, my kid like, I was exactly like that as a kid, and I turned out well, and my parents did not accommodate or lower demands. And so why do I need to do it with my kid? Like, why can't
Mm.
they just get through it like I did? And like, some of these parents, it's like, I got a PhD and now I'm a professor or I'm a lawyer. And like, if my parents hadn't pushed me, I wouldn't have done this. That's like the type of resistance I hear a lot.
I know, and it's tough, right? Because none of us are against helping kids to grow and to, right? But it's like, how do we frame that in a way that is being more attuned to the correct level of demands and expectations? So, but when I hear that, I mean, the one of the things that comes to mind again is like, well, again, your kid is not exactly the same as you, and I might not say it like that, but I mean, that is something that certainly comes to mind. Again, I would be wondering, what was this parent who's maybe saying like, oh, like, I ended up fine and I'm a lawyer now and whatever, I would still be wondering like what their experience of being treated in a certain way was like and what it was like to be understood or not be understood. So, I think that it usually takes some teasing out, and typically what we're really talking about is fears, right? Like fears of what will happen to my kid if I don't do A, B, C, and D. Right? And that is something that I think is worth talking about. And then we also get into some of the practicality of like, well, is this thing working, right? Because typically with a PDA, what we're seeing is like, well, maybe you're getting some compliance because the kid is masking, or there's sort of a fear in the moment of something getting some kind of consequence maybe. But broadly speaking, like those types of approaches aren't going to work well. So sometimes this also can link to a broader conversation around like, well, what is actually working? And typically we can get parents to get on the same page around their broader goals of kids to be happy, et cetera. But the route to sort of get there is where some of the conflict can come in. So that's some of the stuff that comes to mind with me. Like whenever somebody's saying that, I feel like there's some kind of layers of the onion to peel away. And over time is what we try to delve into. But how have you handled it? I know you kind of come across this kind of thing a lot, and it's a tough
Well,
issue.
I'm not a couples therapist. I have done
Sure,
coaching work
sure.
to try and help parents in a like private container to get on the same page for sure.
Yeah,
But I would say the majority of the work is like one parent is leading everything,
yeah.
and they have a resistant spouse or partner, like kind of resisting or trailing behind. And so, if that's the case, I often just encourage the parent, especially if they think their partner might have demand avoidance of whatever kind,
Right.
to step into that same idea they're stepping into with their child, which is like, I'm not going to directly teach, correct, or have an agenda around timelines or how this other person processes. I'm going to embody and model how I'm integrating these tools. And what I've found is like, often when usually the mom lets go of trying to make their partner learn at a certain pace and adapt at a certain pace, I would say about half the time with that autonomy and space, they sort of eventually catch up on their own.
Right, right.
because
No, that's a really good point.
they've been given the autonomy, but I'm not in there facilitating, right? Like I would certainly say like if you can go see a therapist that can facilitate some of this. But if they're just in this intractable situation, like for example with an ex-spouse or they're, where they just can't make any traction or the parent just refuses to even engage on the topic, then
Hmm.
we let go entirely of trying to convince them and focus on trying to communicate on like, what they're going to do specifically in terms of the kids' needs. Like I would like to experiment for 2 weeks, bringing our son chips on the couch during meal times and not make him sit at the table. Are you okay with
Hmm.
that? Right? Instead
Hmm.
of like talking about PDA, because that just gets
Right.
like, ah!
Right. And then look at what does that do to your relationship? What does that do with for regulation, trying these things. And like think sometimes we can look at the improvements that might happen because of that as sort of tying in with goals that both parents share. Right. So yeah, but I like that. I like what you just said there.
I mean, in the simplest way, it's like for anyone listening out there, if it's totally intractable, it would be like use the same tools that you're learning for your child and apply them to your partner, which is like give them autonomy in their journey.
Right.
Yeah, but
It's so hard because you're right. They both parents have different. They're at different steps on the same journey, right? And they might be at
yeah.
different places at different paces, and yeah.
So one thing that has helped me when I have facilitated these conversations, A is framing it as an experiment of like, let's just try this for 2 weeks and collect data.
Hmm.
And we can always pivot if it's not looking like things are shifting or feeling good. And then the second thing is, which can be hard with high performing adults who are neurodivergent, saying like, yeah, you became a lawyer or a doctor or a business person and you're super successful, but often there's other things that might be harder in their well-being, like the anxiety that they manage or difficulty with like sleep or whatever it is. And so we kind of connect it to their children's struggles with basic needs rather than like just achievement.
Right.
Like mental
Right.
health and connection
Right.
and basic needs, not just achievement, because then
Right.
it sort of does become clear like, yeah, I am a lawyer, but I have insomnia and I struggle with X, Y, and Z, and it would be more peaceful to have my life have been less traumatic.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's hard. Like, it's hard to argue with someone who is like, yeah, you are very successful and your parents didn't accommodate you. And I get that argument logically.
Yeah. Right. Right. But as you just pointed out, right, like at what cost? And then again, I come back to, we got to play like, play with the hand we're dealt here, right? Your kid is not exactly the same. And so let's really try and understand this. But, getting back to this idea that, parents being on different journeys, it is so hard. I mean, it might really be that, the work for the parent that's trying to get the other parent to change that, to come to some place of acceptance. And as you pointed out, like if it's a dynamic where there's a lot of arguing and sort of back and forth and kind of a constant cycle of arguing about the same thing. I mean, typically, playing the blame game is not going to be helpful, right? I'd rather have that couple work on their connection and closeness, broadly speaking. And sometimes as we can kind of get out of the cycle and these constant arguments, and this is a really common issue that like couples that I see might have is like, how do we handle these behaviors with my PDA? Or sometimes if we can kind of remove ourselves from that for a moment, work on broader connection and closeness, like sometimes these other issues kind of fall into place over time. I have seen that happen too.
Oh, that's
But there's a way that I think, in a way that sometimes the challenges that some of the parents that work with experience, it's like their kid is really challenging them to strengthen their relationship for sure, right? It's like there are extra stressors, and of course there's blessings and beautiful things and strengths that the PDAers give too, right? I don't want to say it's all something negative, but I also think we need to be realistic, and especially in this context of lack of adequate understanding and support, that it is an extra stressor for families, right? And so again, I would really want them to, to sort of like see it for what it is, that like this isn't about blame. This isn't about that is sort of an unhelpful way to kind of frame this. Whereas, and again, maybe we can get some connection and closeness in other ways too, so that these problems fall into place over time. We kind of get a better handle on things over time, but it's really, really tough for sure.
Yes. My husband and I went through our own brief, luckily, stint of being on different pages. And for him, like, we still joke about it, even though at the time it wasn't funny.
Sure, I bet it wasn't.
What's the theory of change, Casey? Like, what's the logic behind what you're saying? And I'm like, I don't know. I just heard the word co-regulation and like say, time in instead of time out. And I was like, I couldn't articulate like how it would work. And I think that's like sometimes what, if we have a more linear thinker in the couple, like, it's like, okay, I can be on board, but give me the logic and the plan.
Totally. Yeah, and sometimes going through these really hard times and coming out on the other side really strengthens your relationship in the long run. I mean, I think that's important to keep in mind too, right? It's not, I think that there's sort of a myth in the autism space, like the myth of the 80% divorce rate. Have you heard of this? Where like,
well, I didn't know it was a myth. Like, I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, there was a study showing that like a long time ago that parents of autistic kids are way more likely to get divorced than parents of non-autistic kids, right? And that's what kind of like gets picked up in the media, and that's what gets talked about. But they've done many studies subsequent to that, including a very, very large study through Johns Hopkins University, really finding that there's no differences actually between parents in terms of the actual divorce rate. There still can be extra stressors for sure. Obviously, there can be extra stressors, but yeah, I think again, it's like how can parents work on strengthening their relationship to be able to withstand those stressors? That's the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it being true either way, right? Like, I think it's so extraordinarily stressful. But isn't just the general population divorce rate like 50% anyway?
Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah, it's very high. It's true. Yeah.
So I've had Alex in our program, and he has brought up this topic that's called ghosts in the nursery, which I had never heard before. And I was wondering if you could share it with our listeners. What is it, and how do you see it playing a role in the PDA space, or parents of PDAers?
Yeah, great question. I mean, and I think this ties in with the concept of intergenerational transmission of trauma. Yeah, the concept of ghosts in the nursery. So the clinical social worker and psychoanalyst named Selma Freiberg, actually at University of Michigan, near you, cool, who talked about this. And it really refers to this idea that like parents might kind of carry with them the sort of negative or traumatic experiences that they had growing up themselves, and that kind of comes into their own parenting experience here. So I'll give you actually just a concrete example from my own life, maybe this to kind of help illustrate this. So maybe a couple of years ago, one of my daughters, maybe she was 5 or something. So she was like kind of running, kind of happy-go-lucky, kind of focused on something fun with her sister, and like running down a kind of a sidewalk, but there was a driveway and it was kind of a busy street. And there was a car that was, kind of turned on. Now the reverse lights weren't even on, but I didn't really know that. And my daughter was just kind of like pretty blithely, just sort of like running down the sidewalk, focused on this fun thing with her sister. And like my reaction to that, which, to be fair, like a lot of parents are going to have some reaction when there's a safety issue with their child, obviously, right? That's sort of an adaptive thing. But, and those who know me know that like I'm not a yeller. I really try not to yell at my kids. But what came out of me in that moment was like really jarring to myself and to my child, right? And I think that when and I look at my own kind of parents' history and the history of my own parents, actually, interesting thing and very tragic thing is that both of my parents had siblings who were killed in car accidents, right? So very tragic things, right? So very interesting. This is both of my parents around the same age, their siblings were around the same age and killed in car accidents. And so like, I think there's a way that maybe it's something kind of extra gets sort of transmitted into me in this moment where the reverse lights aren't on. She's not like she's walking into a street with moving car, with a moving car. So, that was a more kind of concrete example of that sort of this idea of ghosts in the nursery, intergenerational transmission of trauma. So like this can absolutely play out, to your question around PDAers, right? It's like, how was I parented when I did this thing, right? Or let's say I needed an accommodation around a sensory issue that was really not understood, right? And I was sort of it was dealt with in this way, right? It was not accepted. It was not understood. And I have my own trauma around that, with this trauma being misunderstood or being mistreated around some of these experiences I didn't have control over. And so then what are my, I don't want to say natural, but, what are the tendencies that I might have when my own child does something? Is my tendency to react the same way my own parents did when I did something like that, right? So that's just sort of that's an example of how this plays out, right? And I think this is why when with part of the question around is like, how do we get parents maybe to sort of move in a certain direction? I often do like to think about what were their own experiences being parented. How was self-regulation modeled for them or not modeled for them, for example, right? Like these kinds of things can be very, very important to delve into.
So did the boomers learn to self-regulate?
Such a broad question. Maybe not as much as we would have liked, right?
Well, just like going back to the 1950s, like parts of it, I'm like, that would be so good for a PDA kid to just have like 8 other kids next door on the block, outside, autonomy, like nobody really paying that much attention to them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think I'm just thinking of my family story, right? Where my
Sure.
mom was one of
Yeah.
6, right?
Right.
And it was like on her block, there were like, just on her little block were like 52 kids, like 10 and under, right? So it was just like
Wow.
my grandmother was just spending most of her day doing housework and cooking, right? She
Mm-hmm.
wasn't like on the floor playing one-on-one with her kids or, talking about emotions or co-regulation. So it's like there were both
Mm-hmm.
of this like a lot of autonomy and a lot of dopamine with all the kids, but then also not potentially
Mm-hmm.
like if it would have been a PDA nervous system needing that like deliberate signaling of safety from that safe person because it's impossible if
Mm-hmm.
you have so many
Right.
kids. And it wasn't culturally part of 1950s parenting.
Oh, right. Absolutely not. Children will be seen and not heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Sometimes thoughts like that pop into my mind and
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And this is why, I mean, I think even parents of neurotypical kids report sort of like difficulty with grandparents and how they kind of handle or understand their kids, and then as parents, the way they see the grandparents parenting their PDAers or, trying to be a caregiver, like there's definitely big things that come up there, right? Like I've seen everything from, parents getting really triggered because the child might be getting triggered. And I know there are great grandparents out there, and I do not like to overgeneralize this, right? But I do see this dynamic a lot where, things have really changed, right? And like a PDA informed parenting approach, very, very different, obviously, right? From a lot of the things that we grew up with and our parents grew up with. So, yeah.
yeah. I've also spoken with parents who like had that experience of like a more traditional or authoritarian parenting, even though they were neurodivergent, but not recognized as such. And then the grandparents doing amazing with the PDA kid and doing all the accommodations, and they're feeling triggered because they didn't receive that same thing as a child at the same age. So it
Yes, good point. Good point.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and
Ghosts in the
it can play out
nursery,
in different ways.
they're there.
Yes, ghosts in the nursery. Oh yeah, it's there, whether we want them to or not. I think of them as the uninvited guests. Like we don't necessarily want them there. But then there's angels in the nursery too, right? Like there's there's experiences of good, loving, nurturing attachments and being understood, right? And so how can we try and pick and choose, right? So hopefully we can find some of the good in that too.
Yeah, I love that. Angels in the
Yeah.
nursery too. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it was Alicia Lieberman, the psychologist over at UCSF across the bay here, who talked about that, right? I like that. It's not just the sort of the negative stuff, but how can we sort of let the angels in the nursery win over, maybe.
yeah. Yeah, like just referring back to my grandmother, like ultimately she was a very loving, attentive mother. She was just doing it differently according to the standards,
Sure.
right? So that was like
Yeah.
the angel of like a present, attentive, like very loving mother just through a 1950s frame.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So before we end our chat, I want to go back to something that you've said and see if we can pull out some tips from it.
Hmm.
One thing that I love that you've said is like when parents are sort of in that either power struggle or just constant arguing, you were talking about like, can we facilitate connection and communication outside of that? So do you like, for example, like if you have a couple that you're doing therapy with, do you have like things that they might try or experiment with in order to facilitate that? Or do you sort of walk them through a process where they can figure out how to connect more?
Yeah, I mean, it is different with each couple. Like, I don't think I have one or even a few things that I would say I do with every couple. But I mean, some concepts I think about, like if there's sort of a lot of arguing, right? The concept of a cycle where, like, and a lot of couples find themselves arguing about kind of the same two or three issues, like for decades sometimes, right? And sometimes it's not so much like whether to resolve that issue, but like how can we manage that issue so that it has less impact on the good. So I think that if it's a dynamic where there's arguing and fighting around it, right? Like then I'm thinking about, okay, right. So similarly, a similar concept with like if there's a dysregulation with your child, we might help the child or we might need to take a break if we as the parent are feeling flooded or the child might need to take a break. It's kind of a similar concept with couples where I think on a neurobiological level, like if we're sort of flooded, we might need to like actually take a break. And I think ideally the person who's saying like, hey, I'm feeling flooded, like I need to take a break. Ideally, that is the same person who also says, but in 20 minutes, like I'd like to kind of find a time to try to come back to this issue, right? I mean, so that's just like kind of dealing with maybe arguments in general. It depends on what the issues are, like how we might want to handle it. I do think sometimes I see what's called in the couples therapy world like a pursuer distancer cycle. Have we talked about that in maybe
I
another
was
group?
gonna, yeah.
Yeah, right. So this idea that like maybe the pursuer maybe wants more closeness and tries harder and harder to get kind of connection and closeness and maybe reassurance from one of the partner who may be more of the withdrawer. And these are kind of slightly oversimplified and like people's relationships can be more nuanced than this. And sometimes these things can actually switch where like it's certain year or decade or month, like one partner is the pursuer and then it switches or the other one is. But the withdrawer, often, at least stereotypically, you might have like a more avoidant around feelings or harder time with vulnerability, right? And having a more difficult time kind of tuning into their needs and feelings and maybe ignoring their own needs for closeness. So, sometimes sort of like trying to dig into that, what's going on there? How can we kind of help parents to understand their own needs? Kind of helping parents to be more vulnerable with each other can be really helpful. And, getting back to something you said earlier, I mean, over the years, it's been more and more clear the amount of parents that are with where one or both partners is neurodivergent themselves, right? So how does that play in to their relationship dynamics, right? And maybe one's need for closeness and connection, doesn't fit with one's need for kind of like space and stillness to regulate their own sensory system, right? So like, how does that play into all of this? It can be really interesting, figuring out like, okay, so maybe some of the sort of, if we're trying to make suggestions about how to deal with an issue with a child, one of the partners has ADHD and has difficulty with working memory or kind of proactively preventing something from happening. How does that partner put something into place to kind of try to compensate for some of the executive functioning challenges? Or, does another partner who's maybe more concrete or need very specific suggestions about what they need, about how to show support to the other partner, and other things. So like we do want to, so there's a lot of different ways this could play out depending on the specific couple. But yeah, all these things can be really interesting to work with.
Yeah. Can I say two things that have been helpful in my marriage?
Yes, please.
Okay, one, especially in the hardest times of burnout, was being explicit about caregiving shifts. So even if we were all together in the house, one person would be responsible explicitly for Cooper, meaning like delivering the food, de-escalating, providing one-on-one attention without distraction, undivided attention, and figuring out like dopamine and things to do versus the other who, at least when my younger son was smaller, now he's neurodiverging in his own way and like we're figuring it out. He's 6. It was more like parenting, right? It wasn't like the caregiving responsibility of like, you are responsible for this. So like we had decided ahead of time, okay, from this time to this time, like you are on Cooper, you are the caregiver. And so I think for parents, before they realize they have a child with a nervous system disability, it can really be like, well, who's going to do what? And like they're melting down and who's going to step in? Maybe, mom's quote better at it, but like dad wants to take some of the load off of mom, but they haven't explicitly talked about it. And there's no real way to get better at it than trying to do it without mom in the space. So caregiving shifts. And then just in terms of like the way our brains work, like I need to often express and process things verbally, but
Right.
my was immediately into problem solving, and I'm like, I'm not there yet. So being explicit about like he has learned to ask like, do you just want to express or do you want me to solve the problem with you?
Right. Right. No, that is a very common thing and really natural. Sometimes people really don't want problem solving. And
Yeah.
this is when I think when parents are having a hard time, connecting and feeling on the same page and feeling like in the stress of everything going on. I mean, it can be really important to try and carve out time. I know it's easier said than done, but to kind of like have these, what sometimes the Gottmans or the two psychologists who have written a lot about couples therapy and patterns in couples, they talk about just the importance of sort of building a culture of appreciation, kind of reminding yourself, and pointing out some of the positive qualities in each other, trying to find little times, this idea of like bids of connection, like, oh, just my partner reaching out. Oh, I can't chat with them about this thing, but maybe I can say, okay, but I would like to on Friday. How can parents really sort of have stress reducing conversations, right? Where it's not about solving the problem. It's just about sort of like finding some time just to connect with each other about what's important to you right now, what's going on, what is the most stressful thing, like asking open-ended questions, like finding these time for this. I know can be really, really hard, but can also be really important, especially if you're getting into, these dynamics with your partner.
Yeah. I mean, I will say like when we first started, like after about 2 years of my son's crisis, we finally were in a space where we could try and go out to dinner together, like with our staying behind.
Right.
Just walk somewhere nearby. And I would like the first dates we went on, I would just weep through the entire thing because I couldn't, like I hadn't gotten to process with him. So we would go on these dates that were meant to be romantic or whatever, and I would just cry in my soup the entire time.
Oh, yeah, but you needed that because sometimes you need space from stressors to be able to let some of those feelings come out. And yeah.
Yeah. Also joke about our romantic dates where I would just weep and have meltdowns the entire time. But we got through it. We now have actual topics of conversation.
Non-weeping dates. Yes. Oh boy. Yeah.
Hashtag goals, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, this was so informative and fun talking to you. And I know that our community and audience will take away a lot from this, especially the fact that it's normal to.
Very normal.
Very normal. And I'll just add one PS. Like, I would say there were 2 or 3 years in my marriage that coincided with my son's burnout that were just functional, like partnership. Like it was not a romantic endeavor, it was survival. And we're now on the other side of that, stronger.
Right.
But like you can get to the other side of that and find some of that like romance again. But yeah, I mean, I questioned my relationship a lot because it just felt like we were just like partners in keeping the family ship from sinking.
Yeah, you talk about having to split up for holiday. Can't even spend Christmas together, right? If the whole family's together, it's too much. It's splitting the siblings, like that, among other things. Can be a real challenge.
Yeah, but it's okay if you're doing that. You'll get to the other side.
Sometimes there are really tough decades or a period of years, right? And it doesn't mean it's like that forever, right? And I do see that too. That like ultimately, right? Like the experience of parenting can ultimately strengthen that marital bond. It does happen.
Just sucks along the way.
Yes, there can be some real growing pains. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, Alex. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me, Casey. As always, it's great to chat with you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.